Okay. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions I can answer before everybody gets started?
The review sheet has Sigmund Freud and Impressionist ethics.
Oh, that needs to come off of there. Sorry about that. Let me look at that. That's for next exam. So let me, you can just cross them off, but I'll go in and fix it.
Gotcha. I think for the other stuff, I guess I could just wait for
Okay.
the end of the main lecture.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see here. Let me just look at that study guide that you're looking at so I can fix that. So I can see what you mean. Sorry, this computer I have is really slow. The one I use on a regular basis is much faster, but our desktop computer is old and it's just kind of a dinosaur. And it slogs along, especially when I'm wanting to do something quickly. So
I know that feeling, especially when you need to do something important and it wants to be extra slow.
yeah, it's always the way that works. It's like, I don't think it's any slower. I just think like when you're in the space of really trying to get something done, it just it seems to kind of pick at you a little bit. Let's see. Yep, I see that. Impressionist ethics. And you know what? That review sheet that's posted, let me see. I had one. Oh, you know what? I have one that's a little bit better to post. So let me just do that real quick so that you can have it right in front of you. I wanted to just sort of update that one a little bit. Okay. Go ahead and use the one you have for the review for right now, but I will update the one that goes online so that you can have, I sort of pulled out a few different concepts that I thought would be helpful to you. And I'll go over that before we hang up so that everybody knows to look there for the information on the study guide. It's essentially the same one that's already there. I just wanted to update it a little bit for you. So hopefully it'll help you a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about exam 2. So exam 2 is going to be the exact same format exam 1 was. Remember that there are 2 parts to the exam. Part 1's multiple choice, and it's timed 2 minutes per question. And then part 2 is short answer questions. There are 8 of them and you get 10 minutes each. They're worth 5 points apiece. So what if you missed the exam? So unless you've arranged an extension at least 48 hours in advance, If you miss an exam, you will need to provide me some sort of written, documented, university recognized excuse in order to make the exam up. I will ask that you make the exam up within a week, so that you're not holding up the grades for the rest of the students. In addition to, if you're going to make an exam up, you may end up having a situation where you're doing a different exam than the one that everybody else is taking due to test security. So what if you're a student with accommodations? If you're a student with accommodations and you have paperwork on file with DS Services, please just let me know that you are intending to use your accommodations for the exam. A few of you I've already talked to and have already set that up for you. So I'm just going to make myself a note here real quick about that. Okay, sorry about that. So let's look at a list of the artistic eras that we've covered since the first exam. All exam questions will be based on the eras listed below. So we looked at Dutch Baroque, Baroque in Northern Europe, the Rococo. Well, gee, how's come I didn't put Italian Baroque on here? Italian Baroque should be on here. So remember, we've looked at Italian Baroque. English satire and social satire, neoclassical painting, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Orientalism, the art of the French Academy, early photography, and realism. Well, and you know what? I made that mistake in the PowerPoint too. My Italian Baroque slide isn't on there. So give me a second and let me pull in some Italian Baroque for you. I don't know why I would have left that out. And the funny thing is I just sat down and reviewed it and I totally missed it. Let's see if it'll pull up here for me. Okay, well, we'll start with Dutch Baroque, and I promise I will go back in and put an example in of Italian Baroque, and I will give you a list of Italian Baroque hallmarks. But I'll talk to you now about Italian Baroque after we look at the Dutch. So the Dutch Baroque was made for the middle class, and it led to the birth of the modern art market that we see today. Often we see painting when it comes to the Dutch Baroque, and often the Dutch Baroque artists specialize in a particular subject matter. So for example, Jan Steen specialized in Dutch genre painting. Let's see, who else specialized? Rubens specialized in religious scenes that were sort of a combination of North and Italian. Vermeer specialized in Dutch genre as well. So you get these little pockets of areas that tend to have specialties. Typically, we see still lives. Oh, Vanitas is another one of those areas of specialties in which we see still lives that have worldly wares to remind the viewer of their own mortality. Genre paintings like Vermeer's Woman Holding a Balance. Remember that the use of the camera obscura became popular at this time. it did cause scenes to often look a little bit flattened out. So think of Vermeer's view of the Delft. And remember that morality was reminded in paintings because the Dutch are Protestant, and in the Protestant church, you're not allowed to have religious imagery. So if you think of Jan Steen's The Feast of Saint Nicholas, that is an example of one of those genre scenes. Dutch Baroque, this is a Vermeer, the woman holding the balance. You can see that she is pregnant, holding a balance, she's weighing out gold. Weighing out gold is something that was done to see how much you could turn it in for actual currency. Vermeer's paintings are often characterized by this light that tends to come in through one light source. Here it balances off the woman's wimple and gives us this really clear understanding of texture. So just like in the Northern tradition, Vermeer very much focuses on texture, and he focuses on light, and he focuses on those disguised symbolism. The woman holding the balance would have been a reminder of morality, that people should be pious in their homes, spend their money wisely, and not cheat others. The balance was a symbol for honesty in the Dutch Baroque. Remember, in the Dutch Baroque, you also get those vanitases, which are those still live paintings that we talk about. And I'll actually scoot one of those in here after lecture. So let's talk about Italian Baroque. I'm apologizing that I somehow missed it in the list. Italian Baroque often was characterized by extreme measures of light and dark that we call tenebrism. Caravaggio is one of those Italian painters that painted in the Italian Baroque style. Italian Baroque art tended to be very dramatic. It uses extreme angles to pull the viewer in. And often the scenes were biblical. They were biblical stories. Remember that Italian Baroque art piggybacks off of Renaissance art in the idea that Renaissance was ideal plus real equals high Renaissance. Italian Baroque is ideal plus real plus time equal Italian Baroque. So in Italian Baroque paintings, you're often going to get that split second timing that they discuss. For example, in Caravaggio's The Calling of Saint Matthew, it's that split second timing in which Jesus is pointing at Matthew and saying, I'm choosing you as a disciple. The backgrounds tend to be kind of dark, and then you have the light shining on the subject itself. So I will add one of those slides so that that makes a little bit more sense when you're going through the review. I apologize that it's not in here and then I missed it. All right, so Dutch Baroque, not in the North. So not Vermeer, not the Vanitas. Here we're talking about Rubens and Rembrandt. We often see voluptuous women. We see Italian and Flemish ideas meshed together, partially in subject matter, partially in style, and I'll point those out to you here in a moment. Marie de Medici is one of the main patrons of the Dutch Baroque. And two of the artists that we looked at most heavily in the Dutch Baroque were Rubens and Rembrandt. This is Dutch Baroque in the North, or I'm sorry, Baroque in the North, but not Dutch. This is Flemish. This is Rubens. Remember, Rubens trained in Italy as well as in the Northern discipline. And so you get sort of a fusion between Italian and the Northern Baroque styles. And so you get a lot of attention to texture still, a lot of attention to detail of the light, but you also get some of the Italian tendency for imbuing mythology into the paintings. For example, here, this is Neptune. So some of that mythology influence. These women here are women who are maidens of the sea. And you can see how their bodies are very voluptuous. They have lots of musculature that's being described. Poseidon here is very muscular, and we get to see sort of those like nudie figures that Michelangelo was so famous for influencing Rubens in his decision-making and in the designs that he creates. This is Marie de Medici. She is arriving on a boat from France, or into France from Italy. And you can see sort of the heavens are opening up and blessing her return to reign France. Remember in the Flemish Baroque that Rembrandt is also another one of those artists that we look at. He doesn't carry as much influence from Italy as much as Rubens does. Rembrandt is more famous for those really honest, gut-wrenching depictions of the human face. He's very focused on attention to detail. And so the Rococo, we leave the Baroque. At the end of the Baroque, you see lots of nice ornate architecture, and we move into the Rococo. The Rococo is French for shell-shaped and curvilinear. If you remember, the Rococo is characterized by all those beautiful pastel colors. Themes of love are common. And architecture tends to invite this idea of sitting and leisure activity. During the Rococo, the elite spend most of their time in the salons of Paris. And artists who we looked at were Fragonard, Beaufron, Watteau, and Boucher. Background information. Remember that the aristocracy are responding to the death of King Louis XIV, and that we get the very first interior designer, who is Germain Beaufron. This is a common Rococo painting called The Swing by Fragonard. You can see the shell-shaped curvilinear foliage that is present. Lots of emphasis on those pastels. Themes of hedonism and love. Here's the putti whispering about the love between the young lady who's swinging and the guy underneath the swing. You can see this lush foliage is really very much a signature of Fragonard. English satire and English society painting is something that we looked at quite heavily. Artists who we looked at were Reynolds, Hogarth, and Gainsborough. Typically, these were society paintings. They were paintings about, the misbehavior of the bourgeoisie. They were portraits of the bourgeoisie and how they obtained their wealth. They tended to be portraits of sort of recording the bourgeoisie and their place in society. Oftentimes we see an emphasis on the fabric of society and the social class structure of society in these type of paintings. They look very beautiful on the front end, very wholesome. And if you just dissect the social structure in which these paintings were recording, there's a really dark side to that social structure. Oftentimes marriages were arranged in society for financial sake, for title's sake, and we often see a sense of social class system within the painting. For example, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews is English satire. You can see the dog as a social status. Only men who were of the bourgeoisie were allowed to own a hunting dog of pure breed. If you were caught owning a hunting dog of pure breed and you were not of the bourgeoisie class, you could be in big trouble. The land is shown with Mr. and Mrs. Andrews there. The land was inherited by Mr. Andrews through Mrs. Carter's dowry. Mrs. Andrews was Mrs. Carter before she married Mr. Andrews. The land represents the wealth that the bourgeoisie has. But remember, the land and the wealth have a dark side to them. One of those dark sides is the slave trade in the United States, or coming into the United States, as well as colonization of Africa and India, as well as some Asian countries like Vietnam. Oh, the slide's a little bit dark, so I will try to lighten that up for you before I post it. This is English satire. If you remember, these type of paintings were often done drawings of and posted in newspapers, and they're kind of airing the ill wills of the bourgeoisie. The story behind this one has to do with these two. They've been married. They've just been married. It was an arranged marriage, and he's been out catting around all night. We find that out because the dog is pulling a pair of underwear out of his coat pocket, and she is no less innocent. She's been up all night with all her friends having a lovely party. And so really the pastime of the bourgeoisie was to spend a lot of time partying and sort of stirring up a ruckus. Okay, before I move on to neoclassical or classical revival, can I answer questions? Anybody have any questions? Okay. Neoclassical and classical revival had to do with a reaction to the ills of English society and the way that they were behaving, or the way the bourgeoisie were behaving. If you remember, David comes along and says, hey, let's come back and dedicate ourselves to the state, in this case, France. There was an emphasis on mythological themes and classical representations of the figure to come back into the paintings. And that's because oftentimes the classical representation of the themes referred back to classical times of antiquity, like in Rome, where duty and dedication to the state was very important. Brings about an emphasis on patriotism, logical, stoic, and sort of flatly presented emotional scenes. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. We definitely see a representation of Roman architecture in the paintings as well. We saw works by David, Mengs, Canova, Candeletto, Battista, But the ones you should probably focus on the most are the ones by David. So where did this attitude come about? Well, there was a group of people that felt that the aristocracy really needed to return to that duty to the state, because they had been partying for a little bit too long, according to David. And at this time, education of young adults centers on taking trips to Europe, to see the world. Remember, that's the grand tour. And because of that grand tour, neoclassical comes about, back in the United States, back in the large estate designs and plans in England. So here's an example of a neoclassical painting by David. Here you remember that this is the return to the state. They are having a discussion. Well, the painting is about a discussion or an event that's going to happen in which the brothers are pledging allegiance to their dad to go fight to the death for their side, for their home, for their land, for their area. And the women behind them are very worried about their safety. The strange thing about this painting was that it was used as a, it's like the poster child painting for the French Revolution. So even though David was trying to remind people to be devoted to the state, and it was commissioned by the French aristocracy, the opposition got a hold of it and decided it was a great painting to use to rally about their ideas of duty and devotion to the common man and people. Okay, so I didn't give you a big heading here, but Enlightenment painting, I guess my heading's here. So this is Enlightenment painting. So we're moving on to a different era. Remember, Enlightenment painting focuses on education. It rejects the ideas of the divine right to rule. And it mostly depicts domestic genre scenes. So neoclassical is different because it depicts classical scenes. Enlightenment painting, while based on the same ideas of opposing the divine right to rule, is focused on domestic genre and on education. There were famous artists in the Enlightenment: Chardin, Copley, Derby, all are people that we looked at. This particular portrait is done by Copley. It is of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a silversmith, and it's just a portrait of him using his mind, sort of arguing the idea that being chosen by God to rule is not as important as it is to be intelligent enough to do the job and to do a job well. The painting on the right is an Enlightenment painting. It is a domestic genre scene by Chardin. You can see the governess, she's talking to a young boy. Toys are scattered on the floor as a symbol to leave his childhood behind and go begin taking his place as a man in the world. She's brushing off his hat, which is what a gentleman does before he leaves the house to go experience the world around him. And so these paintings represent the idea of the divine right to rule because they're a focus on education. And the idea behind enlightenment has to do with enlightening yourself about or educating yourself, enlightening yourself about the ways of the world and the way things work. And so the Enlightenment painters believed that education was a much better way to get leadership in a country. They felt that if the country was run by people who were sort of brought up in an educational system, that the country would be run better for the more common needs of the masses. So before I move on, any questions about neoclassical and classical revival? I know sometimes the Enlightenment and neoclassicism can kind of get blurry.
Is there any architectural differences between the two?
Not really. Architecturally, neoclassical and classical revival and Enlightenment. I honestly can't say that we really looked at architecture of the Enlightenment. It was more neoclassical, but you could call it Enlightenment. In architecture, neoclassical and Enlightenment try to preserve the things, the buildings that young men saw while they were on the grand tour. So that's kind of how they mesh. The buildings were part of the young man's education, but they were buildings from classical antiquity. So a lot of times they would take a tour of Greece, to see the Parthenon. They would go to Rome and see the Colosseum, the Tempietto, the Parthenon, and the Pantheon. And so because of that, they would come home to their very large estates, and the large estate usually had large amount of grounds with it. And so taking a stroll within the estate was something that was a favorite pastime of the upper middle class. And so they would build buildings that they saw, or they would build miniatures of the buildings that they saw while they were on the grand tour. And so you get this meshing when it comes to architecture between the Enlightenment ideas and neoclassicism. That's a really good question, Brandon. Thank you for asking it. Okay, so let's talk about Romanticism. Romanticism was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution spurs revolting of the divine right to rule, right? So the Industrial Revolution grows the middle class and allows the middle class to have a larger voice. And Romanticism is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. There are people out there who think that the Industrial Revolution is literally destroying our land. It is destroying our social structure. It is destroying life's order. And so romantic artwork often depicts the horrific. It evokes an emotional response. It's supposed to really move the viewer. Artists tend to go to real extremes to communicate or to feel certain events so that they can paint them. For example, Turner is an artist that we looked at. He went to such extremes that he strapped himself to the prow of a ship during a hurricane so that he could come back home and paint what the hurricane looked like and felt like while he was strapped to that prow of the ship. Most of them weren't quite as crazy as Turner, but you do get some pretty fantastical works of art from it. Goya was another one of those painters who used Romanticism in a way to communicate the horrific, but he does it under the disguise of Romanticism because what he's really doing is protesting the divine right to rule. Benjamin West was one of the very first painters that we looked at in the death of General Wolfe. Romanticism typically does exactly what its title says. It romanticizes the subject matter. And I'll show you what I mean here in a minute with this painting by Turner. Let's see. I told you the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in Europe, and the European economy is based on the slave trade at this time. Europeans don't own slaves, but they are selling them in the New World. This becomes an important subject matter for the Romantic painters. Oftentimes, their paintings are published in literature about abolition. William Turner was one of those artists who were often asked to paint to protest the slave trade, and he was an abolitionist. Here you can see the sublime represented in the weather. The concept of the sublime is that there is a force out there greater than oneself that is deserving of awe and wonder. And Turner feels like he has a desire to paint this awe and wonder, but he doesn't exactly know what that sublime looks like. And so in comes, let me strap myself to the prow of a ship to learn it. You can see in this painting here, there are these large black areas. Those are iron shackles that are floating to the top of the water. Yep, remember I said iron shackles floating. That's not something that usually happens. Iron sinks when it goes in the water. And so that's what he's doing. He's romanticizing the situation. He's reminding the viewers that are looking at this that this is a slave ship, that the slave ship was sinking. Therefore, they tossed the crew overboard, or they tossed the slaves overboard and saved the crew, which was something common that happened because slaves were worth the insurance money. And you can see that the shackles float to the top of the water. Obviously, shackles sink, they're made of iron, they don't float. But Turner is trying to remind you of the atrocities that are happening and why abolition is necessary. Another one of those artists that we can see a little bit more practically in how they romanticize a scene is through Goya. In this particular painting, even if you don't know what the conflict is about, you see that Goya demonizes the soldiers here to the right by not showing you their faces. He points the gun directly at this figure here on the left, who holds his arms out wide, stretched and open, with the light shining solely on this man, likening him to Jesus hanging on the cross. You don't see bloodshed in any place but this lower right-hand corner here, which draws your attention to the man who looks like Jesus. So even not knowing anything about this battle, you can see that Goya romanticizes the scene by not telling you anything about the soldiers here and giving you lots of information about the destruction of the people on the opposite side of those guns. Remember that Goya opposed the Spanish Inquisition, but worked for the king, and so often had to sort of hide his political views within his art. A sort of subcategory of Romanticism is Orientalism. Like Romanticism, trying to air the ills of the oppression in the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, Orientalism points out the negative habits of the bourgeoisie when it comes to exploiting people that aren't part of the Western world. For example, you can see this painting of the boy with the snake charmer. This is done by Jerome. This painting down here is Ingres' famous Grand Odalisque. And you can see the attention to detail of pattern and themes from the eastern part of the world. You've got a man here playing a flute with a basket in which we assume the snake came out of. He is wrapped around this young man's nude body. And then you see people dressed in dress that we typically associate with the Middle East, as if he's entertaining them. You see a instrument on the back wall that is an instrument that's used in Middle Eastern music. And then behind them are these highly patterned pointed arch architecturally, well, it's painted architecture that has roots in religion in the Middle East. So Orientalism is a romanticized viewpoint of the Middle East. Here you see in Ingres Grand Odalisque a romanticized viewpoint of what a harem would look like. Lots of attention to texture and detail here that is common in Orientalism art. Orientalism art is basically art that's rooted in racism. It's a way of othering Middle Eastern culture, basically. We've seen many examples of that today in the modern world, like if you think of Aladdin. The image of Ingres Grand Odalisque has to do with this woman that is white. He gives her body traits that are desirable and that are ones that typically were not seen on white women in Europe. White women in Europe tended to be thinner. They didn't tend to have wider hips. And so he paints a woman who is sort of a composite of all of his all of the male desires of traits that were considered desirable in a woman. But this time he sort of turns it on its head and depicts traits of what a white woman would look like in a harem. Okay, so moving on to art of the French Academy. Art of the French Academy is art that was favored over other types of art, mostly art of the new modern age. Art of the French Academy was one that was favored by the upper class and the aristocracy. Typically, they were themes of mythology and angels. They loved to make the male gaze one of the main subjects of the painting. Subject matter is non-confrontational in terms of French society and the rights of the upper class. We see lots of nude women, lots of angels, and lots of mythological subject matter. The artist that we studied the most in terms of art of the French Academy was Cabinet. And remember that the French Academy at this time is rejecting important painters like Manet. And last but not least, realism. So realism will be on the test. I'm sorry it was crossed off in the syllabus. I'll go back in and fix that for you. But we want to be sure that we get it out of the way so that we can move on to talking about Impressionism. Realism as a movement is one that sort of rode the coattails of workers revolting in parts of Europe. Painters here believe in only representing what is seen with their own eyes. So if you remember that slide I had that said Manet said, show me an angel. No, that was Courbet. He says, show me an angel and I'll paint you one. He very much feels that he wants to paint life in front of him. He wants to paint the world that is around him. And so you get the Stonebreakers as an example. Realist art is logical, and we see scenes that show exploitation of the working class. Excuse me. In this case, an old man and a young school child out breaking up rocks in a field. So stone breaking is very back-breaking work. It's very hard work. And the bottom line is the young man and the older gentleman should be at home resting and relaxing, but instead they do not have a home to go to, and they're out breaking up rocks and carrying them off so that the land can be developed. Realism became a movement shortly after Karl Marx and Engels' critique of capitalism. Workers are revolting in Europe, and the invention of the camera changes things a lot. Realism is a counter movement to photography. Manet is one of those who is fighting photography very much so. And the realist painters feel like if they don't capture what's going around them and paint, that perhaps photography will make their job obsolete altogether. Okay, so that is all I have for the slide review. Do I have questions that I can answer for you from the review sheet?
Is there anything you could talk about in terms of Velázquez's early style versus late?
Sure. So in Velázquez's career, if you go all the way back to Baroque, Velázquez is Spanish Baroque. So I will go back up here to Baroque. Now, obviously, note that Velázquez does not follow the Dutch hallmarks. I will post the Italian slide. Velázquez sort of starts or sort of fits in better with the Italians. In the beginning, Velázquez paints in a very hyper-realistic way. So he's very much following that formula I told you of in terms of the Baroque artist, in terms of his ideal plus real plus split second timing equal Italian Spanish Baroque. So ideal, in the beginning, Velázquez's work is hyper realistic. For example, when you look at his image, The Water Carrier, the painting is so realistic that you can actually see a drop of sweat from the jar in which the water is being held in. It has this crisp, logical feeling to it. It doesn't tend to evoke a more emotional response. As Velázquez grows as a painter, he travels to Italy and has more education in Italy. And he comes back to Spain. He paints for the court painter of Spain, or for the King of Spain, King Philip. And when he gets back to court, he starts using a technique called impasto, in which he evokes a more painterly feel in his subject matter. If you look at Las Meninas, you can see that there's lots of buildup of thick paint on the canvas. So that's the difference. He goes from really hyper realistic to communicating textures through thick buildup on the paint or on the canvas. And it's just a completely different technique. Did that clear that up for you a little bit, Brandon?
Yep.
Okay.
I can't pronounce this, but it's like right below that, right below the Velasquez question. It's I'll post it in chat.
Okay.
That
I don't see the chat bubble coming up. Let's see. Can you spell it for me? Oh, Japonesme, is that what you're looking at?
yeah.
Yeah, Japonesme needs to come out of there. I apologize. That's a impressionism thing. I need to repost that review sheet for you. I apologize. There were a couple things on there that were from the Impressionist era.
Okay. Since we're on the Baroque, in terms of the Little Dutch masters, I guess that would be a good segue into that period.
Sure. So the Little Dutch masters, examples of those masters are like Vanitas painting by Rochelle Royche. Vanitas are a very special type of painting. They're still lives that remind the viewer of their own mortality because the living things in the Vanitas tend to be decaying and dying. Genre scenes from the Little Dutch masters like Jan Steen, who paints sort of the folly of the middle class in which they're sort of acting up and yucking it up. Those paintings were meant to remind the viewer that they needed to live a pious and moral life. So Little Dutch Masters really comes from the fact that the Dutch Baroque artist needs to find a marketable niche within the art market. And so some painters like Rochelle Royche stick to Vanitas and that's all they paint. Other artists like Jan Steen stick to genre moral scenes and that's all they paint. Let me think of the other one. We also get Dutch genre in Vermeer, but there was another one that hit my thought process when you asked me that. It'll come back to me. But those are that's what's meant by Little Dutch masters, just masters of a particular type of art, and they kind of stay in that lane because that's what works for them.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess with Pope Urban VIII, was this was this kind of like tied together with Catholic Counter-Reformation?
Yep. So Pope Urban VIII and the Barbarinis are the ones that built the baldacchino during the Baroque time in Italy. So remember, Pope Urban VIII is tied to the to St. Peter's. He's the Bernini lover.
With the building that was hated by the public because of the face sculpture that was placed on Michelangelo's design.
Yeah. So you're talking about the dome scandal, the idea that so the guy Michelangelo designs the front facade and the public hate it because you can't see the dome, right? Like everything's all about the dome. You remember when we started, like the Florence Cathedral was this giant ordeal because they love the dome. So they don't like the fact that as you get closer to the building, the dome disappears, which just is a reflection of perspective. But at any rate, Pope Urban VIII commissions the the forum, the arms that reach out the courtyard from the church. And so Pope Urban VIII had a lot to do with the design of how St. Peter's ended up looking in the interior and the exterior, because he loved Bernini so much, and because a lot of he put a lot of money into developing St. Peter's the way he wanted it to look.
In terms of I think it's pointillism.
Yeah, take that one off there. I noticed it whenever I downloaded it. I already took it off of mine, but scratch that off of yours.
Okay.
I will update the sheet. Pointillism is something that happens during Impressionism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it the same thing for Fête Galante?
No, the Fête Galante is a Rococo term. Remember, Fête Galante literally means outside party. And Watteau is the one who paints about the Fête Galante.
Okay. In terms of a la prima, I think I have some idea of it, but I just wanted to clarify what it was.
Sure, alla prima means to paint directly on the canvas.
Is this particularly more prevalent in like Baroque period on up, or is there a higher period this becomes more, I guess?
Well, so we first look at alla prima when we talk about wait a minute, it just slipped my brain. Venetian Renaissance. We first talk about alla prima when we talk about Venetian Renaissance. But other painters that paint alla prima, I would say Velázquez. That would pertain to Velázquez, which is why it's on there. But we'll see more about alla prima as Impressionism comes up.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that the effects of non-local colors on there, is this Rococo because of the I guess the more lively it looks?
The effects of non-local color has to do with color that's sort of reflective. We haven't learned that much about that. Go ahead and take that off of there. That will come up more so when we talk about Impressionism. So I had already taken that off of this one that I was starting to update for you. So I'll finish updating this one, and that way anything that seems unclear will be shored up. Is there anything else on there that you're like, I have no idea?
Let me take a look. I think everything else I recognize. Yeah, well, there's some artist names that you put on there that might be important. Joanne Yachman and Winkleman.
Oh, Jan Joachim Winkleman. He wrote a book. And now that you ask me that, I will actually list the book that he wrote. He was influential in the Baroque, but I will go back and look up that book that he wrote. It's important because it influences the Dutch Baroque, I believe. But I will go back and confirm for you. And then actually I'll note it on the sheet so that it's there. So if you want to go back and look it up, you can, just to have the information at your fingertips.
Gotcha. I guess for me, everything else seems clear. Although I'll note that it says the French Revolution, Russia, and the U.S. I know about the French Revolution and the United States Revolution. Was Russia? Was there a portion that I missed, and the chapter is missing the Russian Revolution?
No, just note that Russia has a revolution just like France and the US. That's all. The workers' riots really went clear across Europe. So that's the important thing that you need to know. It just all started with France.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Oh, there's my effects of non-local color. I'm gonna take that off of there right now. There we go.
I think that's kind of all the questions that I have
Okay.
right now. Really, I think I'm good. Everything else makes sense to me.
Great. Okay, so I am going to update the sheet, repost it. I'll send an announcement out that says, hey, I updated the review sheet after we did the online review. Some of the things that were on there didn't make sense to keep on there. And then if you have anything else that you need or want to know about, if you just want to message me or give me a call, I'm happy to answer them, okay?
All right. Thanks again, Jennifer.
You are welcome, Brandon. Have a great day and happy studying for the week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.